There's a lot to discuss in episode 8 of The Last of Us, a lot to pick apart, but one interesting question I have is where emotionally do they go from here as characters? Because 2 episodes ago we had this heartbreaking talk between Joel and Tommy where he expressed his fear about failing Ellie, the way he feels he failed Sarah and Tess and Sam and Henry, and it was a wonderful addition to the story that made me feel excited specifically for this episode because it was Joel's chance to not fail Ellie, I thought. That's what happens in this bit of the game. Despite struggling after his wounds, barely over the infection, he charges off, killing and even torturing people, doing absolutely everything he can so that he does not fail Ellie, so that he reaches her. Which is partly me remembering the game wrongly, but what I think we're left with is this fascinating conflict under the surface that I find so interesting, and we're going to get into all of that, plus what we can make of David as a character, his psychology, this community he seems to have built up. Let's discuss all of it now. So technically, yes, Joel doesn't actually do much to help Ellie this episode. In the game, you kill a ton more of the townspeople, and it's a big reason why the 2 of them are then able to walk away, whereas in the show, I don't know, maybe Joel killed a load more of these people off screen. You do have to wonder why none of this group heard the gunshots and noticed their makeshift church burning to the ground. You know, surely some of them would have rushed over and spotted Joel and Ellie and then tried to kill them. So yeah, maybe Joel killed people off screen. Not making that clear does leave some confusion here though, and make it feel a little like Joel didn't really achieve anything in all of this brutality. And in a way that's the question I have. In episode 6 Joel felt it made him weak that he was hesitating in moments, having panic attacks, feeling increasingly reattached to humanity, let's say. He felt that was his weakness, a sign that he was going to fail, and so in that context for Joel to then go on a bit of a rampage this episode, killing a lot of people despite being wounded and reaching Ellie, is he relieved by that? Is he pleased to see himself being that brutal again, to know that he can still do that when he feels it's necessary? Because that's such an interesting idea. On the one hand, sick with himself about this brutal side and trying to avoid it, like the wonderful parallel between the torture scene here where they point out map directions and the scene with these 2 and how civil and almost friendly that was. Joel doesn't want Ellie to see brutality, he wants to spare her that kind of world, and yet at the same time is he pleased that he can still be ruthless. He half might hate that side of himself, the way Tommy somewhat judges him for it.
I don't judge you for it.
However, he can justify it to himself under the idea it was all for Ellie, to save her, to keep her safe, to not fail the way he felt he failed Sarah. So yes, perhaps he feels successful this episode to kill all these people without taking a wound this time and to reach Ellie, or perhaps he feels he's failed again. He did reach Ellie, but ultimately he arrived a little late. He wasn't there to stop her almost being chopped up, and he wasn't there when David tried to... YouTube doesn't like me to say the word, so I'll refer to it as SA. Yes, Ellie was able to prevent either of those things happening, however, it's all still going to have an effect on her. And my god, do you feel the effect? I mean, I loved Ashley Johnson's portrayal of Ellie in the games, however, watching the cutscenes there, you don't feel the terror in that depiction compared to Bella Ramsey.
Wait! Don't do it! Please don't do it! Please!
You feel in these scenes just how truly awful the experience is. And Ellie has to kill David and James in very violent, up-close fashion. You know, Brian she shot once from a distance, then hid behind the wall, but here there's no avoiding what she has to do. She has to be brutal here. And so yes, in that sense, despite moving heaven and earth to reach her, Joel simply could not stop Ellie from going through what she is put through here. Both the trauma as a whole, but also her having to be the brutal one here. She's the one who ends this episode with blood all over her face. Is Ellie turning into Joel? I talked back in episode 6 about how Joel needs to teach her things. On the one hand, that's good, episode it becomes essential. On the other hand, wasn't half the point of Joel's violence to protect Ellie from that kind of world? He didn't even want her holding a gun initially, he apologised when she had to use it. You know, I'm not saying there's a good and a bad to this, I'm saying what would Joel think about the possibility of Ellie turning into him, of Ellie having just as violent a side as he does? I don't know, he might be relieved to see that he can still be brutal, he might not. With Ellie though, he might be pleased to see that she can defend herself, or he might feel horrified at what she, a child, has to do. What if all his violent efforts to protect her from a harsh world have simply set an example for how she should live? You know, do you think it's intended that her killing of David somewhat parallels Joel killing the guard in episode 1? Which is why I find it interesting that all Joel can actually really do for Ellie this episode is to hug and comfort her. He can't stop anything happening to her here. The opposite of violence is what she needs from him. She needs someone gentle and caring to comfort. All of which is for me to say I don't know what he takes away from this experience. That's my answer. He wants to protect Ellie so that she can A, cure the world, and B, grow up in a better, less violent world than he has lived, except now she's just as violent as him. Does that mean he's failed? Does it mean violence wasn't the answer and was a bad example to set, the way Tommy seems to suggest?
We survived the only way we knew how. But there were other ways.
Or does it mean Joel simply wasn't good enough, quick enough, which again either means he needs to be even more brutal, or it might lead into the idea that he should have let Ellie go, passed her on to Tommy, or to someone else he feels is better to look after her. All of which are questions that could become very, very important when we presumably get to them reaching the Fireflies next episode. Because I feel like this is a conflict around brutality that's been building the entire show, and I would not be surprised if we're left with some pivotal decision between Joel leaning into the brutality even more to protect Ellie, or letting her go, passing her on to the Fireflies maybe, or back to Tommy, or perhaps finding some other way that isn't violence, who knows what. And Ellie too, she has to come to some conclusion about her own violence. David in many ways has just been a direct example for what brutality can lead to, the horror example. David compares himself to her, says they both have a violent heart. What is Ellie to think about all of that? Again, I don't know what will happen next episode, and that makes everything I've said so far a little bit redundant because I can't give a concrete answer. What we're at internally with both these characters is a massive crossroads, and I'm really fascinated to see exactly where that goes. At the very least, I imagine they've come out of this episode feeling, hoping that everything they've been through, everything they've done, that it's all got to have some purpose to be worth something. And the logical answer to that, of course, is this cure, making a cure from Ellie. For her in particular, that's got to feel massively important. Not just having failed to cure Sam, as I discussed before, but also if I have a violent heart and if I've lost all these people along the way and had to do bad things, then it's doubly important that I can do something good for the world through my DNA at least. For a child that's experienced nothing but loss, living in a world that quite literally yearns back to a better past, of course she wants to be able to do something good to save the world. Again, nobody spoil whatever happens next in the comments. You know, if you need to write spoilers based on what happens in the game, add spoilers to the start of your comment and then leave a few line breaks. Anyway, there are other things we need to discuss. I'm going to do that now, but first, the thing you've all come to know and love.
You're gonna point to
the best damn world building tool on the market.
And it better be the exact same spot your buddy points to.
Hello world! Have you heard of World Anvil? World? Sponsoring this video. World Anvil is an online tool for world building, character creation, campaign building and playing in all of these games, planning and writing your stories, and possibly some other stuff. I just use it for my novel, but it does other stuff too. World building can be difficult, you know. I used to use a folder for different Word documents which seemed simple enough to begin with until things get complex and you end up with a disorganized mess and you suddenly wish you had hyperlinks to different characters or mythologies in your notes. Or imagine this, say you want to design your own calendar for your world. You can pop in all the information, have the calendar generated, then build a timeline of historical events linked to that calendar or several calendars with all sorts of hyperlinks you might want sprawling to other articles, and then upload a map and link different events to locations on the map so you can easily see where and when everything happened. I find that so handy. And if the timeline affects how the map looks, such as a big city getting destroyed or whatever else, you can add altered maps to reflect those changes. And there are other tools as well. This is just the one I find most exciting, especially when it is all surprisingly easy to set up. In all my use of World Anvil so far, I haven't ever bothered to watch any of their tutorials on how to do stuff. I've just got on with it. I have a link in the description and as a pinned comment with the code TREE, which offers you 40% off all their subscriptions. There are different levels and you can even try out the free version initially, so give it a whirl, take it for a test drive. World Anvil. Now me back to talking other things. Having played that clip with the map there, it's kind of cool how Joel refers to the second guy as his buddy, just as Ellie refers to James as buddy boy. I don't know, that just feels like a subtle nod to show how well the two have bonded, just in them using similar words to each other. David is a great character in this episode. Horrible, disturbing. Oddly, the moment that creeped me out the most this episode was when he touched her hand through the cage. Instantly I shuddered all over. The thing that makes him most interesting, I think, is the wonder about his townspeople. There's a sense right from the off that his right-hand man, James, who looks and sounds oddly familiar for some reason, can't think why, he doubts David a little.
I sense doubt in there.
And we know why, in hindsight, having finished the episode. He's very uncomfortable about the idea of eating humans. As we see in the great contrast between people eating hungrily because they don't know it's human, James or the cook being very hesitant, and David just eating very calm and with slight elegance. In hindsight, we know their initial conversation about venison, elk, and rabbit is actually about human bodies they have hanging up.
How much do we have left? Venison. Elk, rabbit.
The reason I bring up James's doubt of David's leadership, a doubt that I think many of his people have but aren't yet confident to voice, is because David later talks to Ellie about wishing he had an equal.
I'm a shepherd surrounded by sheep, and all I want is an equal.
You know, James is the closest thing he has to an equal, and yet David doesn't like being challenged or questioned. He shuts down James when he tries to question things, and he demands to have James's full loyal support in everything.
But I need to know you're with me.
And James' answer there is so small, as though he wants to but daren't speak any further. And I think about the scene where David slaps the girl, Hannah.
But the truth is, Hannah, you will always have a father. And you will show him respect when he's speaking.
You know, I've already talked in my series on this show about the idea of control and how love or an equal companionship means someone who can challenge you and question you and sometimes pull things in different directions. But David can't abide that. He wants his people to
Love me.
but his idea of love is unquestionable, thoughtless obedience to him. So much so that he'll hide the truth and feed them talk of God, despite the fact he doesn't even believe any of the stuff he's preaching. Which is then also interesting from their perspective, I suppose. You know, the cook knows she's making meals from human meat, but she chooses to believe the lie. She chooses to turn a blind eye. I do then wonder how many others in the group are happier just surrendering themselves to the lies. Or not even necessarily lies, but misdirection, you know. Focus all our thoughts on the idea that God will provide when we are in need. Don't think about exactly what or how he will provide, just focus on the belief bit itself, you know. There is something oddly dark and poignant about the idea of their church being a steakhouse. The two great things about that moment with Hannah are, one, how the talk of a father gets blurred between father meaning God and father meaning David, and how he is now her dad. And also the hauntingly real experience of hitting Hannah and then holding out his hand for her, as though he's being caring, as though to make her think he was right to hit her, as though it's for her own good. How awfully manipulative it all is. David feels cordyceps is an example of nature at its best, growing and securing its future through violence, which is what he feels humanity should be doing. The apocalypse then becomes the outlet for his violent heart that he talks about, turning it into this positive he almost glorifies, where previously he shamed himself for his violent tendencies and tried to to suppress those instincts, now he can indulge them, and the idea of anyone challenging that is simply them not being able to handle the truth. And if they can't handle it, they need a father, in his wording, who will make them submit, and as we see, this then leads to SA, which then makes you shudder to wonder how things would have been for Hannah. Perhaps for a long time it's been more than just the cannibalism that's been covered up in this town. Perhaps a lot of them have been turning a blind eye to a lot of things. In that sense though, the only kind of equal David could accept would be someone who 100% agrees with everything he already thinks, which I reckon tells us he wants someone to help him justify his worldview, his beliefs, his violent heart. Someone to say, yes, that's a good thing, David, you can feel free to indulge it. You know, there's a massive difference between accepting and learning to forgive yourself for some of the perhaps violent things you've done in the past. Yeah, a big difference between accepting and forgiving and moving on from it, and excusing it all. David is both a warning for what Joel and Ellie could be, and a reminder for why their bond is so important. Because this is a story about love, after all, how it matters even in the most horrible of worlds. Is their relationship perfect? No, I think every single relationship in this show has had complications, and probably more to come. But he does care for her, and you wonder what would have happened to Ellie if she'd ended up with someone who didn't, someone perhaps like David for a father instead. That's not a very concluding point to end this video on. Again, this video has been one that's less a clear argument from me than just raising ideas for you to think about, so please let me know what you think, and we'll have to probably talk about a lot more of this next week after the final episode. Comment your thoughts. The best thing about YouTube is all your comments. Give it a like too, that helps. Maybe even subscribe or support on Patreon. A big thank you to World Anvil, but otherwise, hopefully see you next time. And as ever, a special thank you goes to Luke Hoare, Trichu Kaber, Michael Gallagher, In Squares, Flying Spider, Samara Salsi, Joshua C. Follier, and Jab Bramwell. Thank you.